Welcome to Trip the Beltway Fantastic. Ukraine's attacks on Russian bases and aircraft on June 1st has sent the media and Ukraine supporters in Congress and Europe into a flurry of triumphal metaphors and hyperbole, from spiderweb and David and Goliath to adjectives daring, stunning, audacious. Ukrainian military officials said 41 aircraft were hit, including strategic bombers and surveillance planes, with some destroyed and others damaged during the attack. This, unfortunately, has unleashed a week of attacks on both sides, but the most fierce from Russia, which over the course of Monday and Tuesday this week launched hundreds of drones and missiles at Kyiv, Karkhiv, and Odessa, hitting civilian areas, including one administrative building of a maternity ward. If the gloves weren't off, they are coming off now with a seeming vengeance. In a matter of days, the peace process, already struggling for oxygen, seems as if on life support. President Trump has threatened to walk away and has expressed his share of frustration with both Presidents Putin and Zelensky. The second round of talks in Istanbul seem to have borne no fruit, with both sides issuing demands that the Quincy Institute's Anatol Lieven called completely mutually incompatible, suggesting that at present, neither side is in fact interested in early peace. So where does this renewed fighting leave efforts to end the war? Will the Russians choose to just keep fighting and taking territory through the summer? How much can Ukraine take? Will the U.S. at some point cut off aid? Will you step in and fill the gap? Here to talk about this today are two good friends and experts, George Beebe, the director of our Grand Strategy program at the Quincy Institute, and Mark Episcopos, Eurasia Research Fellow, also at the Quincy Institute. Thanks for joining me, guys. George, I'd like to ask you first, since you and I were on a webinar with Jennifer Kavanaugh at Defense Priorities a couple weeks ago about this issue of walking away. And, you were pretty adamant that we should not walk away, that we needed to persevere through the peace talks in Istanbul and beyond, that walking away would actually be more harmful to the process than helpful. But in recent days, after these attacks and the political ramifications that had followed, you seem to have gone through somewhat of a conversion. Can you talk a little bit about that with us?
Well, Kelly, first, thanks for having me on. Second, I have changed my thinking a little bit since that discussion on whether the U.S. should, in fact, disengage from the peace process. And the reason is because of the Ukrainian attacks on not just one leg of Russia's nuclear triad, its strategic bomber force, but also attacks on civilian train infrastructure that, in fact, targeted Russian civilians, in which the Russians, I think, rightly called an act of terrorism. And I find it problematic for the United States in that situation to continue providing military and intelligence aid to Ukraine, because I think it's dangerous to American interests for us to do so. Prior to the Ukrainian attacks on the strategic bombers, Russia had actually lowered its nuclear use threshold. They issued a revised nuclear doctrine that said that Russia no longer had to be attacked with nuclear weapons or attacked in such a way that threatened its actual existence in order to justify nuclear weapons use. The new doctrine said that Russia would be justified using nuclear weapons if somebody attacked with conventional weapons in a way that impaired Russia's nuclear retaliatory capability. Well, it's pretty clear that that's exactly what Ukraine just did. And I think it did so knowing full well that Russia had issued this new lowered nuclear use threshold. And the other thing that new doctrine said was that an attack by a non-nuclear state, i.e. Ukraine, done with the support of a nuclear state, i.e. the United States, would constitute a joint attack. In other words, what Ukraine did, I think by implication, made it much more likely that Russia might retaliate using nuclear weapons, including retaliation that might affect the United States directly. So I think the US had every reason to assure Russia that we were not involved in supporting carrying out this attack. In fact, we weren't even aware that it was going to be launched. And President Trump did that in his phone call with Putin that was done last week. And I think that helped temper the Russian response somewhat, although Putin made clear that he had to retaliate under these circumstances. You know, had Russia not retaliated, I think that would encourage a belief in Ukraine and in the West that Russia is simply a paper tiger, not going to back up its red lines at all, and that would be a dangerous situation for Russia to be in. So the Russians had to retaliate, but I think that retaliation was less extensive than it might have been had it believed that the United States was actually involved in carrying this set of attacks out. So that's one thing. The other thing is the attack on the Russian trains. The Russians, I think, justifiably call an act of terrorism. Official U.S. policy is that there is no justification for acts of terrorism, period. Whether another country invades you or not, our policy is there's nothing that justifies terrorism. So I think we have every reason to distance ourselves as a country from that kind of an attack. And that does change my attitude toward whether the United States should, under these circumstances, continue to be providing intelligence and military aid to the Ukrainians because of the dangers of implicating the United States in these kinds of attacks against Russia over time. Mm-hmm. Now, that said, I don't think the United States should disengage from the peace process itself. And we can get into why I think that's the case. But I do think we have a very compelling reason to try to diffuse this conflict and make sure that it doesn't escalate or continue to drag on, because there are all sorts of bad things that can flow from that.
Well, let me ask you quickly, just to clarify, are you suggesting we should cut off aid and intelligence to the Ukrainians now? Or do you just think that that's likely to happen?
Well, both, frankly.
Wow.
And the reason is, imagine a situation in which the Ukrainians continued these kinds of operations against Russia. If that were the case and the United States were still providing intelligence and military support to the Ukrainians while these kinds of attacks went on, for how long would the Russians actually be confident that we weren't involved in planning or executing these attacks? It's one thing for this to happen and Trump to call Putin and say, we weren't aware of it, took us by surprise, we weren't involved in the planning. It's another thing for Ukraine to continue to mount these kind of attacks and for the United States to continue to provide intelligence aid while they're doing it. And the Russians eventually are going to reach the point where they say, okay, look, we can no longer take you seriously. We can't really believe that you weren't involved in all of this. And I think that's a danger we shouldn't run.
Mark, that seems like a bold step. You're never going to hear that vocalized on any other podcast or on any other program or media outlet, that the United States should just cut off aid and intelligence in order to advance the peace process. Maybe you'd hear from Jen Kavanaugh. But Mark, what do you think about that? Are we at a crossroads right now in which these kinds of bold steps have to be taken into consideration in order for this war to end?
Well, thanks for having us on, Kelly. It's always great to be on. So I think there we're in the pre-negotiation stage right now, where we're still trying to figure out a format for effectively ending this war in a durable, lasting settlement. And in these pre-negotiations, I think there are several different tracks that we have to sort of conduct simultaneously, we as in the United States. One is with the Russians. We have to figure out what Russian red lines are, what their minimum bargaining positions are. How do we effectively engage the Kremlin in issues of interest to the United States and Russia in this larger strategic dialogue that is both separate but also inextricably linked to what's going on in Ukraine? And then the other track is our very difficult and so far, unfortunately, unproductive discussions with the Ukrainians and their European partners and friends on what a realistic framework for a settlement can look like. And in this discussion, our greatest leverage is to walk away, because we provide absolutely vital capabilities that the Ukrainians cannot backfill by falling back on the Europeans. Starlink is absolutely crucial for the connectivity that makes the Ukrainian army run. Our intelligence sharing is absolutely vital for Ukrainian targeting capabilities. Our radars, AWACS, even our aid is, of course, extremely significant in helping Ukraine conduct its day-to-day operations. And so if all of that was to come to a standstill, and I would say if we're going to do this, we should do this completely. We should totally sever our involvement in this. Then the Ukrainians would find themselves in an extremely difficult battlefield position. It's difficult to put a date on these things, but certainly one cannot imagine the AFU, Armed Forces of Ukraine, being able to hold out for a very long time if we were to walk away in this complete way. And the Ukrainians know it. The Europeans know it as well. So I don't see, I agree that walking away in a, permanently, completely washing our hands of this is unproductive, because these issues are here. They will persist. We have a vested interest in security in Eastern Europe, on NATO's eastern flank. All of those issues persist, and we should treat them as long-term problems. But in the short to medium term, threatening to turn off the tap can make it easier for us to have the very difficult discussions that we need to have with our friends across the Atlantic and with the Ukrainians. And we need to have a come-to-Jesus moment where we agree on a realistic, viable, pragmatic set of war termination proposals, which unfortunately for Ukraine do involve significant compromises on the part of the Ukrainians. Any agreement has to reflect the facts on the ground. And the facts on the ground are that despite these sabotage operations, despite these attacks on Russian airfields, the Ukrainians are at a clear, distinct disadvantage that will continue to compound going into 2026. And it's in their interest, first and foremost, to strike a peace sooner rather than later. We can help them do it. We have plenty of leverage in these broader issues that Russia wants to discuss. But the Ukrainians are going to have to play ball on the core components of what a settlement can look like, and particularly neutral status, non-bloc status, completely writing off NATO membership, but also plenty of other ingredients that we can talk about. But so walking away in a permanent, complete fashion, I think, is unproductive. But actually doing it, is a crucial source of leverage that I think at this stage we have to use.
Yeah. Well, let's talk about the politics of it. George, I mean, this all sounds rational to me. It sounds realist to me. But considering the mood in Washington whenever you talk about Ukraine and Russia, we are at a point right now where there is a bill to heap on 500% tariff / tax and via sanctions on Russia, a bill that's been sponsored by Senators Lindsey Graham with, I'm understanding, some 80 co-sponsors from the Democratic and Republican parties. They're ready to punish Russia. What kind of response do you think Trump would get if his administration floated this idea that we should just walk away and cut off aid and intelligence sharing, even as a tool towards the eventual end to the war there? Does he have the political energy to or support to actually even do something like that in Washington?
Well, I think the short answer to that is no. It's pretty obvious that most of Washington is not at all in favor of some sort of compromise with the Russians. There's still a great appetite to punish and coerce. Not at all much desire to impose some sort of peace on the Ukrainians that they're not ready to embrace yet. That said, I think that is why I think Trump should not disengage from the peace process, even though I think we've reached the point where we need to cut off the Ukrainians from our support. I think the big issues in this conflict are not actually between Russia and Ukraine. The bigger issues are geopolitical, over the shape of Europe's security architecture, over the respective force postures of NATO and Russia. Those are issues that Ukraine can't be negotiating with the Russians over. But those are issues that the United States must negotiate with the Russians over. And so what I think Trump needs to do politically in this situation is to engage even more intensively with Russia over those bigger issues, try to put in place a fundamental geopolitical compromise. And I think Mark alluded to this. I think the fundamental compromise we need to reach is an agreement on the part of the United States that Ukraine is not going to be part of the NATO alliance, and that the United States is not going to authorize either American or NATO forces on Ukrainian soil. Those are two absolutely critical issues for Russia, without which I don't believe a settlement is going to be possible. But the Russians have to make some reciprocal concessions to enable that sort of concession on the West part. And I think the big one that they have signaled that they're ready to do is to support Ukraine's membership in the European Union. That is something that they were not at all ready to countenance in 2014 after the Maidan revolution. But now I think they are showing indications that they're willing to support that. And I think Trump needs to cement that fundamental compromise in place, reach a clear understanding with Russia. Were he to do that, then I think he's got more room for maneuver, not just politically here in Washington, but also it will provide a context in which some of those bilateral issues between Russia and Ukraine become easier to negotiate. And we can put this war on a firm path toward resolution. That kind of compromise by itself doesn't end the war. It still leaves an awful lot of negotiation on a lot of issues that will not be easy. But I think it changes the dynamic. It changes the political context in which those negotiations take place, and they become easier to pull off.
Yeah, that might be a little difficult given the memorandum that the Ukrainians issued last week, in which they state that they want to have an eventual membership to NATO. They also want to have a number of troops from friendly foreign states on the territory in Ukraine to keep the peace. These seems to be obviously a no-go for Russia. Mark, can you talk a little bit about these demands that both sides had issued last week that, that Anatol had said that were completely incompatible, and kind of signaled that neither side was really ready to bargain? Even if we did come out and assure Russia that we would not allow Ukraine into NATO, that we would not, that we would put parameters on the number of troops, or not allow any U.S. troops or weapons in Ukraine, did they still have it in their mind that they can demand these things, and that the Europeans might be able to fill in the gaps where maybe the U.S. is not willing to play ball anymore.
You know, Kelly, I think there's a recognition in Kiev that this whole thing really cannot go on for a indefinite period of time without active U.S. support. This whole operation of U.S. aid and global aid to Ukraine has been extremely one of the world's most ambitious, and we're allowed to say this now. It's no longer controversial, proxy wars in military history. And your heart really has to be in it. If you're going to do it, you have to go all in the way that Biden did, to fully weaponize, fully mobilize all of the organs of the federal government, the Treasury Department, DOD, state, to pursue this in a single-minded, obsessive way. And this administration simply doesn't want to be part of this in that way. And so I think the Ukrainians see this, and I don't get the impression that they believe that the Europeans can simply pick up our share of the tab and prolong this indefinitely. They and the point behind these blitzkrieg operations that we've seen over the past several weeks, I think, is to compel Russia into this unconditional ceasefire, which would allow Ukraine to essentially win the war diplomatically without having won it militarily. Because the idea behind an unconditional 30-day ceasefire, emphasis on unconditional, is Ukraine is free to, in the meantime, pursue NATO membership, to invite European and Western forces on its soil, to collaborate with Western defense industry in any way it sees fit, to build up its forces in any way it sees fit. All of these are red lines for Russia, and Russia would insist on some kind of on limiting factors, or perhaps to completely exclude these things in an actual settlement, if a settlement was to be struck. So we're now, the two positions are very far apart. The Ukrainians are still insisting on this on simply a ceasefire, which is a formula for freezing the war indefinitely. And the Russians, as George has said, refuse to cede their primary leverage, which is on the battlefield. And if they were to agree to this, they would put themselves in a diplomatically, militarily very, very difficult position. So I see no chance, no viable pathway to this unconditional ceasefire. And that means we are going to have more negotiation, more dialogue, figuring out what the red lines are. And certainly, as you mentioned, the Russian positions are also extremely severe and probably unrealistic, especially on the territorial issues, where they are calling for international recognition of these territories. It's extremely unlikely to happen. But that's where serious, sustained diplomacy comes in. We have to figure out what is the opening position and what the minimum position is. And we're still very far from it.
I totally hear you on there. But are the Europeans encouraging otherwise? Mark Rutte, who is the NATO secretary, said in remarks, I believe, to the Telegraph, I'm going to get this in order here. He says that Britain had better learn to speak Russian if the government doesn't ramp up defense spending. And he's talking specifically about the push to ramp up to 5%. Each country has been, under some pressure from the Trump administration to carry their load. But this, plus the rearmament campaign, this consistent visiting Kyiv, assuring Zelensky that we are there no matter what, are they really egging on Zelensky to push for the ceasefire, to maintain these hardline demands? I go back to Afghanistan, in which people ask, how did they not know that the Taliban would fall and the United States would withdraw so precipitously? And what I was gathering, from, after action reports, was that Ashraf Ghani was basically told by members of our U.S. Congress, don't worry, we'll be there for you. We'll be there for you. We're not going anywhere. And then we were gone and everything collapsed. Is that what we're seeing here? Is Zelensky being told, behind the scenes by whether it's Europeans or Lindsey Graham and Richard Blumenthal and the U.S. Senate, don't worry, we'll be there for you. And what kind of dangerous game is that, George?
Well, I think the short answer is yes. That is what is going on, in part because the Europeans don't want to see a compromise settlement to this war in which each side makes concessions to the other on the other's most critical demands. I think what the Europeans would rather see is a continuation of a stalemate, a frozen conflict, rather than a genuine peace settlement. I think that's a mistake on their part, but I think that's where the sentiment in Europe lies right now. And so they are encouraging the Ukrainians to fight on and to make the case, A, that Russia's not really interested in a compromise. And they're pointing to Russia's lack of interest in a ceasefire as saying that Russia doesn't actually want a peace settlement. And those two are not the same thing. I think the Russians do want a settlement. They want it to include those bigger issues about European security. Those are exactly the things that the Europeans don't want to talk to the Russians about. So that's part of what's going on. Part of what's going on is that Zelensky and his government have learned from dealing with the United States over the past 3 years that when they do things that create awkward political situations here in Washington, that the United States caves, right? They invaded Kursk, for example. They invaded Russian territory without informing the Biden administration of this, without seeking permission. They gambled that Biden would have no choice but to, in the end, come around and support what the Ukrainians were doing. And they were right. That's exactly what happened. There are numerous instances where Zelensky appealed above President Biden's head. Now, who's above President Biden's head? American popular opinion. So he went to the media and made his cases for more U.S. support, for more capable American weapons systems, and jammed Biden politically, and Biden caved again and again and again. The Ukrainians got their way. That taught them that this sort of tactic works. So they are trying it again. There is a media campaign going on that is meant to put President Trump in a corner, force him to agree to things that he doesn't want to agree to. And these attacks deep into Russian territory were also done, according to President Trump, without his knowledge or awareness, in the hope that this would force the United States to get on board and support what the Ukrainians are doing. And I think that's a very dangerous situation, very dangerous for stability in Europe and dangerous for America's own national security. And I very much hope that the Trump administration does not respond the way the Biden administration did to those kinds of tactics.
Yeah, absolutely. Well, thank you both. I really appreciate it. I'm just gonna leave it there, but I want you both to come back on as we turn another corner. We have a whole summer in front of us, and lots going on. So I appreciate you taking the time to join me on Trip the Beltway. Fantastic.
Thank you very much.